"You're not on the list. Please wait outside." The sentence dropped like a slap across a silent room. Cold, public, calculated. Dr. Samira Blake didn't blink. She stood motionless, invitation in hand, rain still clinging to the collar of her coat. No one in the luxury lounge seemed to realize they were staring at the very woman whose fund was bankrolling this entire summit. Outside, rain spattered across the tarmac where 3 private jets sat fueled and waiting. Jets covered under a special ethics protection clause, a clause written and signed by Samira herself. But here she was, being treated like a trespasser. And what no one knew was, she was less than 60 seconds from bringing the whole thing to its knees. "Tell us where you're watching from. And be honest, would you have spoken up or stayed silent like she did?" The woman behind the guest desk, Claire Whitman, had already moved on to the next attendee. A man in a tailored suit breezed past Samira without so much as a glance. Claire's tone shifted completely. "Mr. Rawlings, welcome to the Global Cultural Leaders Summit. We've been expecting you." Samira turned slowly and stepped away from the counter, not wanting to cause a scene. The velvet ropes, the warm lighting, the shelves of curated art books. It was all familiar. She'd approved half of it in the budget 6 months ago. But now, under this roof, in this moment, she was being told, "You don't belong here." No one offered her an umbrella. No one even asked her name. Just assumptions, wrapped in politeness. She walked past the glass doors and into the drizzle, standing just far enough away to still hear what was being said inside. Her fingers curled around the edge of her leather bag, but her face didn't change. From inside the lounge, a junior event assistant, Ella, noticed her. "Just for a second." Confusion flickered across the young woman's face. Then it was gone. Claire leaned across the counter toward another staffer. Her voice lowered, but not enough. "I swear, these people think just having a lanyard means access." The staffer chuckled uncomfortably. Samira stood outside, silent. She had built systems to prevent moments like this, spent years pushing for inclusion, fairness, transparency. The global ArtCred platform, her brainchild, was supposed to be a safeguard, not a weapon of exclusion. And yet, here it was, being twisted in her face. She looked out over the private runway, where Summit Jet Number 3 had just started pre-boarding for senior delegates, paid for in full by the ethics compliance program she created. The irony wasn't lost on her. Samira pulled out her phone, not out of anger, out of precision. She tapped a contact marked Derek, ArtCred Ops. "Samira," his voice came through, calm and alert. "Activate Clause 8.6, she said, barely above a whisper. "Effective immediately. Downgrade this summit to non-compliant. Freeze all disbursements. Notify the international partners." There was a brief pause. "Understood," Derek replied. She ended the call, slipped the phone back into her coat pocket, took one slow breath, and waited. Inside, the shift was immediate. A notification pinged on Claire's tablet, then 2 more. Her brow furrowed as her screen went dark, restarted, then loaded a red compliance warning. "Summit ethics status, non-compliant. Insurance support, suspended. Active funding, frozen. Immediate review required." She blinked, tapped the screen again. Error. In the corner of the room, Tracy Hammond, event director, answered her ringing phone with an upbeat, "Tracy here?" A pause. Then her face drained of color. "You're telling me 3 of our planes just lost flight clearance?" Another pause. "Global ArtCred triggered what? That can't be right." Claire's jaw tightened. She slowly turned toward the glass doors. Outside, in the rain, Samira still stood, composed, dry-eyed. Like a thunderstorm had passed through her, and she alone remained untouched. Ella stepped over hesitantly. "Miss Blake?" she asked, quietly, almost guessing. Samira glanced over. Ella swallowed. I want to say I'm sorry. I didn't say anything, and I should have." Samira didn't respond right away. Then she gave a soft nod, not unkind. "Thank you," she said. "But this isn't about me." In the main hall, a public announcement interrupted the soft background jazz. "Attention delegates, due to unforeseen compliance issues, several departures are currently on hold. Please remain in the lounge for further instruction." Delegates stirred. Faces tightened. Some began checking their phones. A few were already whispering, "Isn't this whole thing backed by ArtCred? What happened?" Back at the counter, Claire's voice trembled. She's the one who controls ArtCred?" Tracy didn't answer. She was already texting someone in PR, frantic, sweating, hopeless. Samira walked back through the sliding doors, her coat still damp, her posture unshaken. This time, no one stopped her. The summit had just shifted, not from yelling, not from threats, but from one woman standing in the rain, remembering every name, every glance, every silence, then pressing one button and watching an entire institution collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Inside the lounge, the air had shifted. The mood was no longer sophisticated. It was suffocating. Event planners who had been casually sipping cold brew minutes ago were now refreshing dashboards, whispering into earpieces, and shooting nervous glances toward the glass doors where Samira Blake had just walked back in. But she didn't rush. She didn't scan the room for retribution. She simply walked, measured, steady, toward a quiet seating area where no one dared sit before. A corner wrapped in soft leather chairs and abstract paintings funded by the same global art grants that were now frozen. She didn't need to make a scene. The silence in the room was already loud enough. Meanwhile, in a room adjacent to the main lounge, marked Summit Coordination HQ, authorized only, Tracy Hammond slammed her laptop shut. "This doesn't make sense," she hissed. "We were cleared last week. All our ArtCred scores were green." "Not anymore," muttered James Wu, the International Logistics Director. "It's red now, deep red. I've never even seen a level 4 override before." Tracy's phone buzzed again. Another missed call. Another message from the Ministry of Culture in Brussels, saying they were pausing discussions until clarification is reached. "We're hemorrhaging credibility," James added, pale. Tracy ignored him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Who the hell is Samira Blake?" James stared at her. "You don't know?" She froze. "She's not just ArtCred's chair," James said. "She designed the ethics gateway. Every scoring protocol, every threshold, every clause in the system. She wrote it." "No, Tracy fumbled. She's just a sponsor, right?" "No," he said flatly. "She is the compliance system. She's the one the system reports to." Across the lounge, Claire was now pretending to organize brochures. Her hands were shaking. Ella, the young assistant, quietly approached. "You should apologize," she said softly. Claire looked at her like she'd grown 2 heads. "I did what protocol requires," Claire snapped. "No badge, no escort, no photo match. That's how security works." Ella didn't argue, but her tone was steady. "You didn't follow protocol. You profiled her." Claire's jaw clenched. "And now, everything's breaking," Ella added. Samira sat alone, her posture upright, her phone untouched on the table in front of her. She could feel the eyes on her, some curious, some ashamed, a few still too proud to look directly. She wasn't new to this. She'd walked into rooms full of silent judgment since her 20s. At 29, she'd stood before a UN panel and presented her theory of cultural ethics as infrastructure. They'd clapped politely and ignored her proposals. At 31, she'd quietly launched Heritage Equity Fund with 1 grant and a single partner. Now, at 45, her signature controlled the cultural legitimacy of over 74 global organizations, and her word could freeze or greenlight billions. So no, this wasn't new. But today still stung, because the very system she built to protect people like her was being used against her by people too shallow to look past her skin, her calm, her silence. She leaned back, letting the quiet wrap around her like armor, until she saw someone walking toward her. A woman, early 60s, silver-streaked afro, long plum-colored coat. She carried herself like someone who remembered 1,000 other rooms just like this. "Samira Blake?" she asked. Samira stood. The woman extended her hand. "Dr. Laverne Douglas, Vice Chair, World Cultural Justice Council. I've been meaning to meet you for years." Samira's eyes narrowed. "I didn't expect anyone from the council here." "Neither did I," Laverne smiled. "But I saw what happened at the front, and then I saw what followed. That override? That wasn't just protocol. That was grace. Strategic, surgical grace." Samira almost smiled, but didn't. "Not grace," she said. "Just accountability." Laverne chuckled. "Maybe, but it was damn beautiful to watch." She sat beside her, crossing one leg elegantly. "You know," Laverne continued, "they've been talking about watering down ArtCred, replacing the core metrics, softening the cultural impact thresholds." Samira's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped slightly. "I know. You just gave them 740 million reasons to leave it alone." Across the room, James Wu appeared beside Tracy with a pale face. "We just lost backup clearance from Zurich," he said. "The ethics freeze has cascaded. It's affecting 4 airports now, and our ESG compliance line was tied to that ArtCred score." Tracy shook her head, almost to herself. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She didn't even explain. "Because she didn't need to," James said quietly. "The system is her explanation." Outside the lounge, a trio of jet pilots, still in uniform, stood grounded beside their aircraft. Phones to ears, flight plans denied. Insurance null. They glanced at each other, then toward the glass where Samira sat with Laverne, unbothered. One of them whispered, "She's the reason we're not flying." Another replied, "She's the reason we were flying in the first place." Inside, Ella stepped toward the counter and picked up the discarded VIP badge meant for Samira. Still sealed, still unscanned. She walked it over, nervously, gently, and held it out. Samira looked at her, took it. Ella swallowed. "I'm sorry. For everything." Samira nodded once. Then, quietly, "Thank you, but I don't need the badge anymore." She placed it face down on the table. The room was hers now, with or without a lanyard. Later that evening, emails went out. 3 partner organizations issued public apologies. 6 speakers withdrew from the summit. The board behind the Global Cultural Leaders Summit called an emergency session. By the next morning, 12 organizations were blacklisted from the next funding cycle. 3 private jets remained grounded under pending ethics investigation, and the FAA had requested a meeting with ArtCred to review its international compliance adoption standards, with Samira Blake as keynote witness. But in that moment, inside the silent lounge, Samira simply sipped her tea, not with pride, not with revenge, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been underestimated again, and had calmly reminded them who they were dealing with. The summit lounge, once full of laughter and small talk, now echoed with nervous silence. The espresso machine had stopped hissing. The servers no longer walked around with champagne. The entire room was holding its breath, waiting for someone to take control. But the only person truly in control wasn't saying a word. Dr. Samira Blake remained seated in the corner, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even reacting. Just watching. It wasn't personal. It was systemic, and now the system was feeling the weight of its own misjudgment. On the far side of the lounge, Tracy Hammond finally left the operations room. She walked quickly, a Bluetooth earpiece in one ear, and her tablet clutched tightly to her chest. Every step she took toward Samira felt like walking toward a verdict. As she neared, a few heads turned. No one spoke. Claire, still at the check-in counter, lowered her eyes, pretending to fix a pile of unused lanyards. "Dr. Blake, Tracy's voice was polite, strained. Samira looked up, nodded once. Tracy took a breath. On behalf of the organizing committee, I want to apologize. We didn't know. Samira raised an eyebrow. Didn't know what? Tracy hesitated. Didn't know who you were. Samira leaned forward slightly. Her voice was calm but direct. You didn't ask. The sentence landed with quiet weight. I understand, Tracy said quickly. It's unacceptable. And I take full responsibility for the oversight. Our staff— You mean Claire? Samira cut in gently. Tracy froze. I don't need a scapegoat, Samira said. I need a system that doesn't make people like me invisible, unless we're holding the funding. Across the room, Claire flushed red. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with the edge of a brochure. Ella stood beside her, arms crossed, saying nothing. Tracy stepped back. Would you be open to joining us in the VIP chamber? The keynote panel is assembling. We'd love your insight. Samira gave a soft, almost amused smile. An hour ago, I was told to wait outside. Tracy's throat tightened. Samira stood slowly, gracefully. I'll join the panel, she said. Not because you asked, but because I wrote the standards you're failing to meet. In the VIP chamber, a curved stage had been set up with 7 cream-colored armchairs, each labeled with name placards. 5 chairs were already filled. Ambassadors, authors, foundation executives, all of them waiting uncomfortably. They had heard the whispers. They knew what had happened in the lounge, and none of them wanted to be the one who looked complicit. As Samira entered, the room straightened itself. A few people stood. One clapped. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. She didn't need a microphone to be heard. Samira took her seat. Her placard, previously labeled reserved, had been updated in haste to read, Dr. Samira Blake, Chair, ArtCred Consortium. Still, she didn't smile. The moderator, a British journalist named Leland Hart, cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our cultural policy panel, he said, voice tentative, I believe there's a more urgent topic that has arisen in this very room today. Samira said nothing. The audience, now packed wall to wall, leaned in. Leland turned slightly. Dr. Blake, would you care to speak on the ethics of access, of visibility? Samira folded her hands in her lap. I built a system called ArtCred, she said softly. Not to reward people, but to expose imbalance, to create a shared language between funding and values. But like all systems, it can only reveal what people choose to see. A beat of silence. Today, someone looked at me and saw nothing important. Just another woman with a lanyard, one who didn't belong. Leland swallowed. But here's the truth, she continued. I don't care if people recognize my face. I care if they recognize the harm that happens when institutions pretend fairness is automatic. Several heads nodded across the audience, some in shame, others in awe. Samira sat back. I'm not here for apologies, she added. I'm here to make sure the next woman who walks into this room doesn't need a badge to prove her worth. Outside the chamber, emails were flying. News of the incident had leaked to a journalist from the Culture Ledger, the largest independent media outlet on global philanthropy. By the time Samira left the stage, her name was already trending on social media. Not because she demanded it, but because the silence she broke had echoed too far to contain. Back in the operations room, Tracy stared at a notification on her tablet. Notice: ArtCred Protocol Clause 9.2 initiated. Public score review pending. Organizing committee under evaluation. A timer was counting down. 72 hours until the summit's public ethics report would go live, visible to 42 funding agencies, 17 embassies, and every attendee on the donor index. Ella found Samira near the exhibit wing, alone, standing in front of a wall of framed photographs from past summits. She approached quietly. You changed everything. Samira looked at her. No, she replied. The system worked. It just needed to be triggered. Ella hesitated. So, what happens now? Samira looked at the image of last year's panel, 7 white men in suits. Then she turned to Ella with calm certainty. Now, the system remembers, and so does everyone who saw what it's capable of. The next morning, Geneva woke up to rain and scandal. The Global Cultural Leaders Summit, meant to celebrate unity and diversity, had become the front-page symbol of hypocrisy. 3 international papers carried the same headline: Black CEO told to wait outside, then crashed 740 mallows in 12 hours. Inside hotel rooms, boardrooms, and airport lounges around the world, executives and cultural ministers refreshed their feeds, watching a system unravel in real time. And in the middle of it all, Dr. Samira Blake. Inside the summit venue, the operations room looked like a war zone. Tracy Hammond stood in front of a wall of screens, each blinking with warning banners from different agencies. One message from the UN Cultural Compliance Office simply read, "Requesting written statement from Dr. Blake within 24 hours before certification is suspended." James Wu was frantically trying to trace back funding partners. "We've already lost Zurich, Lisbon, and Singapore. They're pulling out, Tracy, one by one." "I know," Tracy said, barely above a whisper. A knock at the door. A staffer entered with a manila envelope. "What now?" Tracy asked, not bothering to mask her exhaustion. The staffer placed the envelope in her hands. "From ArtCred Central Office." She opened it. Her stomach sank. Inside was a printed letter with 2 words stamped in red. "Ethics Review Triggered." Claire was packing up. Her hands moved fast, too fast, shoving her things into a slim black leather tote. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the previous afternoon. Not even Ella. Not after the email from Human Resources arrived. Not after the line that said, "Pending internal ethics review, your credential is suspended for the remainder of the summit." And yet, no one said she was fired. No one said she wasn't. Just silence and shame. She zipped the bag shut, stood, and walked out of the lounge. No one stopped her. No one looked up. And for the first time in years, Claire, always the one in control, realized what it felt like to be invisible. Meanwhile, in a sunlit cafe 2 blocks from the venue, Samira sat across from Dr. Laverne Douglas, sipping espresso. "You look calm," Laverne said. Samira stirred her drink. "I'm not angry." "No? I've been angry," Samira replied. "This is something else." Laverne nodded. "Power used gently. It shakes people harder than rage." Samira looked out the window. "I didn't want to make an example out of anyone, but the system was designed to protect people from these exact moments." "And now?" Laverne asked. "What happens next?" Samira took a breath. "Then, I activate Clause 14. Laverne leaned back. "The consequence clause?" Samira nodded. "If a host institution violates ArtCred standards in a documented public setting, they lose access to all ethics-dependent funding pipelines for 12 months. Laverne whistled. "That includes 3 entire continents of grants." "And 42 airports," Samira said calmly. At exactly 12 o'clock noon, the ArtCred Global Ethics Dashboard went live. The lounge screen, previously displaying summit photos, flashed white, then black. Then the words, "Ethics score 42-17. Consequence clause triggered, 12-month freeze in effect." Within minutes, 2 major foundations released statements withdrawing funding. 3 speakers canceled panels. One sponsor, a Nordic art transport conglomerate, pulled $83 million from the summit's logistics division, and a cascading effect began. At the United Nations satellite office nearby, a junior diplomat named Alia turned to her supervisor. "Sir, we're getting flagged." The supervisor looked up. "For what?" "The Blake protocol just went live." He dropped his pen. "Already?" Alia nodded. She didn't waste a minute. Back inside the venue, Tracy stared at the lounge screen as the updates rolled in. Red lines, countdown timers, locked out partner dashboards. She turned slowly and saw Samira standing just inside the doorway. The room fell silent. People made space, like water parting around a boulder. Samira didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Tracy and said, "The summit doesn't need a new program. It needs a new culture." Tracy nodded slowly, holding back tears. "I understand now." "No," Samira said. "You feel it now. Understanding takes longer." Then she turned and walked away. Outside the lounge, Ella was standing by the security desk, watching Claire's name disappear from the access monitor. Samira approached quietly. "She's gone," Ella said. Samira nodded. "She'll think about it for the rest of her life," Ella added. "Good," Samira said softly. "Maybe she'll rebuild something better." Ella looked at her. "So, what happens to this summit?" Samira shrugged. "It'll survive. Bad systems always do. Until they don't." She placed a hand gently on Ella's shoulder. "But the next time someone tells a woman like me to wait outside," she added, "I'll already be inside the system, waiting for them." 3 days later, the front page of the Washington Global featured a new headline: "ArtCred unleashes Clause 14. Cultural funding faces reckoning." The subhead read, 740 million frozen, 6 summits under review, and a quiet woman who changed the rules. And below that, a photo of Samira, sitting, calm, in that first-class lounge, looking like she never needed anyone to open the door for her. The storm didn't pass. It only deepened. By the 5th day of the summit, what began as a quiet humiliation at a first-class lounge had spiraled into a global ethics crisis, and every major institution with ties to the cultural funding ecosystem was feeling it. But the woman at the center of it all, she was already 3 steps ahead. Samira Blake sat alone in her penthouse suite overlooking Lake Geneva. The morning light filtered through gauzy curtains. A tablet rested on her lap. Her fingers scrolled, not through the news, but through live compliance dashboards. Red, yellow, gray. 42 institutions had been placed under temporary ethics freeze. 6 national grant programs halted disbursement entirely. 12 summits, including the one she just left, were officially marked under re-evaluation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reform. And this time, there would be no hiding behind PR statements or empty apologies. Downstairs, in the hotel's executive conference wing, a closed-door crisis session was underway. Ella stood just outside, earpiece in, relaying updates from internal monitors. Inside the room, a group of summit executives, minus Claire, who had quietly resigned, sat across from a newly arrived team of auditors from ArtCred Central. "You're telling us the entire system was watching?" one senior official asked, incredulous. The lead auditor, a woman named Renee Vasquez, gave a tired smile. "Ma'am, this summit was running on ArtCred accreditation. Your lounge, your panels, your donor list, all filtered through ethics compliance layers. So this was like a test?" "No," Renee replied. "This was real life. You failed. The system simply showed you how." Back in Samira's suite, her phone buzzed. It was a call she'd been expecting. Dr. Thorne Ulrich, director of the UN Office of Cultural Integrity, appeared on the screen. "Dr. Blake," he said, his voice calm but alert. "I want to thank you for how you've handled this." "I didn't do anything special," Samira said. "Oh, I think you did," Thorne replied. "You exposed something we all knew but never addressed. Our institutions may celebrate inclusion on paper, but we still rely on gatekeepers who see power before humanity." Samira nodded. "The numbers speak louder than I ever could." "We'd like you to speak anyway," he said. "Tomorrow morning, at the General Assembly satellite session." Samira didn't blink. "Will Clause 14 remain in effect?" "Yes," Thorne said. "And we're working with ArtCred to implement a new oversight panel using your original framework." Samira smiled, just slightly. "Then I'll be there." That evening, news broke of a massive donor reallocation. The Gulliver Foundation, one of Europe's largest arts endowments, pulled 300 million from its prior grantees, redirecting it toward initiatives approved under the updated ArtCred compliance tier. In short, Only organizations meeting Samira's ethics protocol would see a dime. By midnight, 6 more foundations followed suit. What started as a scandal was now policy. At the Geneva airport the next morning, Samira arrived alone. No entourage, no fanfare. She walked past the first-class check-in counter where she'd once been dismissed. Ella was waiting at the private gate, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "You came alone?" Ella asked, handing one to her. "I arrived alone the first time," Samira replied. "Might as well stay consistent." Ella smiled, but said nothing. She knew better than to push when Samira was in game mode. They boarded a diplomatic flight bound for the UN complex. The cabin was quiet, polished, sleek. But Samira barely noticed. Her mind was already preparing for something else. Not a speech. A blueprint. At the UN satellite hall, the room was packed. Representatives from 52 nations, 24 NGOs, and 18 funding councils filled the seats. Thorne Ulrich stepped to the podium. "Before we begin this session on global cultural equity, we are honored to welcome the architect of the ArtCred protocol, Dr. Samira Blake." Polite applause, some nods, a few skeptical glances. Samira walked slowly to the front. She didn't read from notes, she didn't raise her voice, but the room went completely still. "I'm not here to retell what happened," she began. "You've read the headlines, you've seen the dashboards, but data is not justice." She looked up. "I'm here because a woman who looks like me shouldn't need a scandal to be heard, and neither should anyone else." She walked forward slightly. ArtCred was never about punishing bad behavior. It was about reminding you that every system is only as ethical as the people who enforce it. And every person, every gatekeeper, carries a responsibility to look again. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Samira paused, then finished. "Power doesn't lie in who gets invited. Power lies in who rewrites the invitation list." And then she sat down. The room stayed silent for 4 full seconds. Then applause. Longer, louder, fuller than anyone expected. Back in her suite that night, Samira received one final email. Subject: Implementation phase approved. Body: ArtCred Tier 1 protocol will become baseline for all ethics-linked funding worldwide. Effective date. Immediately, she sat back. The system had spoken. And this time, it spoke her language. The world didn't shift with a bang. It shifted with a buzz. A quiet notification on Samira's phone. She was sitting on the balcony of her suite, wrapped in a gray shawl, staring out at the calm surface of Lake Geneva when it came in. Incoming call. Mrs. Elena Mukasa, Director, Avia a Consortium. Samira stared at the name for a second, then answered. "Elena," she said. "It's been a while." "Not long enough, apparently," Elena said with a smirk. "Your summit's still all over the front page." "It wasn't my summit." "No," Elena replied, "but it became your aftermath." Samira let the silence hang. "So," Elena continued, her voice shifting, "you know why I'm calling, don't you?" Samira sipped her tea. "AVAA doesn't make courtesy calls. What do you want?" Elena paused, just enough to let the weight settle. "We're ready to implement Tier 0. That sentence changed everything. Tier 0 had been Samira's most controversial idea. The idea that funding, licensing, and international partnership would no longer be reactive to scandals, but preemptively bound to ethics performance through real-time behavioral data. Not just after discrimination, not just after public outrage, but before a contract could even be signed. It had sat dormant for 2 years, until now. Within 48 hours, headlines began to pop up across major financial and diplomatic media. Global culture shifts gear. 1.4 billion in funding tied to real-time ethics. Tier 0 goes live, 21 airports, 9 ministries, 44 grants now linked to ArtCred pre-certification. Suddenly, this wasn't just a cultural story, it was an infrastructure shift. And Samira? She didn't appear in any of those headlines. She didn't give interviews, didn't tweet, didn't even release a statement. Because real power doesn't need to explain itself. But not everyone was silent. Inside the glass towers of New York, London, Nairobi, and Singapore, people were panicking. Several senior officials from airlines, hospitality groups, art institutions, and logistics firms woke up to find that their compliance status was now publicly displayed on the ArtCred dashboard. Color-coded, time-stamped, undeniable. Claire Morgan's former employer, the Wexley Group, was flagged yellow. Their upcoming multi-million-dollar logistics contract put on hold. Internally, someone asked, "How did this happen overnight?" One junior analyst answered bluntly, "She gave the industry a mirror. We just don't like what we see." Back in Geneva, Samira was meeting with a small circle of allies, quiet professionals who had backed ArtCred from its earliest days. Ella was among them, seated at the far end of the room, taking notes. "Tier Zero's implementation won't go smoothly," warned Dr. Leandro Ruiz, a cultural ethicist from Brazil. "I don't expect it to," Samira replied. "They'll challenge the scoring system," he added. "They're welcome to," Samira said, cool and unmoved. "But the system doesn't accuse, it reflects." Ella raised her hand. "Can I ask something?" Everyone turned toward her. She looked directly at Samira. "What happens to people like Claire?" The question landed hard. Samira took a breath. "There are two kinds of people," she said. "Those who fear being watched, and those who change when they realize they are." She let that settle. "I don't hate Claire," Samira added. "I hate what she represented. Maybe this system gives her a reason to shed that." Ella nodded slowly. Later that evening, Samira took a call in private. This time, it wasn't from Elena. It was from Secretary General Hugh Bennington, the highest-ranking official in the Global Ethics Coalition, which coordinated intergovernmental funding across 73 countries. "Dr. Blake," he said, not wasting a second, "you've created a seismic shift. Some are calling it dangerous." "And what do you call it?" Samira asked. He paused. "Necessary." She didn't smile. She just waited. "We want to propose," he continued, "that ArtCred become one of 3 permanent monitoring systems for global ethics compliance under our charter." Samira's voice was calm, measured. "No." There was a pause. "Excuse me?" he asked. "I won't be a third of anything," she said. "Ethics doesn't need a committee, it needs clarity." The line was silent for a long time. Then help us rebuild it your way. By week's end, a new agreement was signed behind closed doors. The Blake Accord, a transnational charter requiring real-time ethics transparency for all cultural, hospitality, transportation, and event-related partnerships in countries using the ArtCred system. No more hiding behind PR. No more compliance as a checkbox. For the first time in decades, values became currency. Samira didn't celebrate. She didn't even attend the private signing dinner. Instead, she visited the same lounge where she had been denied entry that first day. She walked in, quiet, alone. A new attendant stood behind the desk, young, nervous, but polite. "Good afternoon, Dr. Blake," he said. "Welcome. Would you like your usual corner?" Samira blinked, slightly surprised. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He gestured warmly. "We're honored to have you." She walked to her seat, pulled out her tablet, and looked over the latest ethics heat map. Red zones were fading, green ones expanding. The system was learning. People were learning. And all it took was one moment of being told, "Wait outside." Samira Blake had never needed a seat at their table, because now they needed a seat at hers. The summit had long ended, but the ripple effects refused to settle. No longer confined to the elegant corridors of Geneva, the consequences reached into embassies, private boards, and cultural institutions around the globe. Yet amid all the noise, Samira remained still deliberate, still calculating, still unbothered. She returned to Washington, D.C. quietly. No press releases. She stepped off a red-eye diplomatic flight, alone in a dark blazer and low heels, walking through the terminal like any other traveler. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same airports that once overlooked people like her were now operating under the very standards she helped build. She paused at a lounge entrance, not to enter, but to glance at the small tablet posted near the door. It read, "Certified, ArtCred Tier 1, Compliance Verified." Samira nodded once, almost to herself. That's the thing about silent reform. It speaks even when you don't. A week later, she was invited to a private discussion at the World Finance Ethics Forum in Manhattan. It wasn't on the main stage. It was by invitation only. A room that used to exclude people like her without ever putting it in writing. This time, she received the invite directly from the chairman. Ella walked with her to the building entrance. "You ready for this?" Ella asked. Samira smiled faintly. "They're not." Inside, 25 of the most powerful names in global finance sat around a curved table. Marble floors, glass walls, zero accountability, until now. The chair, a man named Grant Winthrop, stood as Samira entered. "Dr. Blake," he said, stretching a hand. "It's an honor." She took it. "You asked for a conversation," she said evenly, "not a performance." Grant gestured for her to sit. "We want to understand how to move forward in this new climate." Samira didn't sit. She didn't need to. "I'm not here to validate your confusion," she said. "I'm here because your industry confused courtesy with character for too long." Murmurs around the room, a few narrowed eyes, but no one interrupted her. "You funded movements you didn't understand. You endorsed institutions that excluded people who looked like me, and you called it progress because someone sent a tweet with a hashtag." She walked slowly around the table. "No more hashtags," she said. "Now it's metrics." Afterward, she declined lunch, declined the town car, declined the offer to connect over drinks. She walked out alone. Ella caught up with her by the curb. "That went well," Ella offered. "They clapped at the end," Samira said, dry. "They always clap when they're scared." Later that night, Samira sat at her home office, staring at an old photograph. It was grainy, printed, framed. Her mother standing in front of a library, smiling, but not the kind of smile people give when they feel welcome. The kind that says, "I got in anyway." Samira had never forgotten that expression. That's why she never asked for permission. That's why she built her own systems. And now, the systems were working. By the following Monday, over 143 organizations had voluntarily signed on to the Blake Accord. Several countries requested training directly from ArtCred. And for the first time, the World Economic Council added an ethics compliance score to their Global Competitiveness Index. Samira's name wasn't even in the report. She didn't need it to be. But the story wasn't over, because late one evening, an unexpected email came in. Subject, reconciliation request, from Claire Morgan. Ella was the one who noticed it first. "Are you going to open it?" she asked. Samira waited, then clicked. The message was brief. No excuses, no spin, just a sentence. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway. How can I do better?" Samira stared at the screen. "Should I delete it?" Ella asked softly. "No," Samira said. "Print it." Ella blinked. "You want it printed?" "Yes," Samira replied. It's the first time she's ever made room for someone else. 2 days later, Samira spoke at Howard University, standing in front of students who looked like her, but younger, wide-eyed and sharp. She didn't mention Geneva, didn't mention Claire, didn't even mention the money. Instead, she told them this. Sometimes, the door isn't locked. Sometimes, the room is just built without your name on the invitation. That's when you decide, will you knock, or will you build? There was silence. Then, a standing ovation. In that moment, Samira realized something. This was never about getting into the room. It was about redefining what the room even meant. And in doing so, she hadn't just changed her own story. She'd rewritten the blueprint for an entire generation. They called it the Freeze Week. 7 days after Samira Blake quietly walked out of a summit that had once dismissed her, the consequences had escalated to a level no one had anticipated, and few could survive. $740 million in cultural and institutional funding remained frozen. 3 private jets belonging to senior organizers were grounded for insurance violations. 12 high-profile partnerships had been blacklisted across Europe and North America. And the summit itself? Cancelled indefinitely. But that wasn't the story anymore. The real story was this. No one could trace it back to Samira directly. She never raised her voice, never wrote a public statement, never appeared on a single broadcast. Yet everyone knew. The woman they told to wait outside now decided who even got to enter. Inside the Geneva offices of the Global Cultural Initiative, panic had turned to paralysis. Their top ethics auditor had resigned. Their chairwoman had gone on leave. 2 vice presidents were under formal review. A board meeting was held behind frosted glass, voices low but frantic. "How did this happen?" one man whispered. "It wasn't just one thing," someone else said. "It was a pattern, and she gave that pattern a mirror." Across the room, a younger board member leaned back and said quietly, "She didn't break the system. She just stopped pretending it was working." No one disagreed. Back in Washington, D.C., Samira sat in her quiet office, watching the sun rise through the glass. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She was already thinking 10 steps ahead. Ella entered with a fresh cup of coffee and a stack of printouts. "Flight logs from the summit organizers," Ella said. 3 grounded in Zurich, 1 flagged by AVIAA. Samira raised an eyebrow. "Let them sweat." Ella hesitated. "You sure about not speaking up publicly?" Samira looked up. "I wasn't humiliated publicly. I was erased silently, so now I respond the same way." She paused. Silence makes them fill in their own guilt. The next day, Samira received a request from the European Parliament's Committee on Cultural Integrity. They wanted her to testify, not as a victim, not as a protester, but as a policy architect. "You've created something real," the email read. "We need to understand how to replicate this model across all sectors." Samira forwarded the message to Ella with a single line. "Let's draw the map." But not everyone was ready for that map. In London, a group of influential donors attempted to launch an alternative to ArtCred, a softer, more business-friendly ethics verification process. Within 72 hours, 3 of their lead investors pulled out after being flagged non-compliant in Tier 0. Because now, no one wanted to be on the wrong side of her silence. Samira didn't attend any of the retaliation meetings. She didn't sue. She didn't threaten. She simply made one call. To Soraya Taleb, head of the Continental Infrastructure Fund and the final approver for over $3 billion in annual ESG-based investment. Soraya answered on the first ring. "Samira," she said, "say the word." "I need a clause added," Samira replied. "Any grant recipients in Europe must now meet ArtCred Tier 1 as a baseline." There was a beat of silence. Then, done. That was it. One call, one clause, a whole new standard. By the end of the week, 61 institutions had to choose, upgrade or lose everything. The irony? Samira still hadn't given a single interview. And yet, people were quoting her in newspapers, in keynote speeches, even in corporate memos, none of which she approved. Ella brought her one such clipping. It was from the Financial Tribune. Samira Blake has redefined ethical influence, not through branding, but by quietly owning the infrastructure beneath the room. Samira shook her head. "I didn't redefine anything," she said. "I just reminded them who always built the room in the first place." That weekend she flew, this time on her own private jet. No longer a guest, no longer a delegate, but a gatekeeper. She landed in Oslo for a roundtable meeting with the Nordic Ethics Council. As she exited the plane, a red carpet had been rolled to the tarmac. A small security detail flanked the protocol officer. Photographers stood at a distance. Ella stepped beside her, adjusting her sunglasses. "They've never greeted anyone like this before," she said. They've never needed to, Samira replied. At the Summit Center, Samira didn't walk through the front. She entered via the side. Not because she had to, but because she could choose. Inside, her name was on every placard. Not guest, not contributor, not special speaker. Just Dr. Samira Blake. Architect of the Blake Accord, she sat down, silent. The room followed. And in that moment, surrounded by officials who once signed off on silent exclusion, she didn't have to say a word. Her presence was the policy now. The Oslo Ethics Forum was never meant to be historic. It was supposed to be a quiet gathering, a closed-door review, a polite follow-up to the Geneva debacle. No cameras, no headlines, just suits, statements, and constructive dialogue. But then Samira Blake walked in, and suddenly, no one remembered the agenda. They seated her dead center, not at the end of the table, not near the coffee trays, but center, flanked by 6 ministers and 3 heads of state. A digital display behind her simply read, "Accountability and Cultural Investment." The moderator, an older Norwegian diplomat named Henrik Ahlberg, cleared his throat nervously. "Dr. Blake," he said, "we're honored to welcome you. If you're willing, we'd like to begin with a reflection on your work." Samira didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just spoke. "I was never supposed to be in this room," she said. Her voice was even, calm. "Rooms like these weren't built for people who looked like me. They were designed to be locked by politeness and policy." She looked around. "But the irony is, I never asked to be invited in. I just built the mechanism that measures the air you breathe in here." There was a silence, a deep, awkward one. A few tried to smile. Others took notes, pretending it wasn't personal. But it was, and they all knew it. "ArtCred," she continued, "wasn't created for retaliation. It was created for memory." She stood up slowly, letting her presence fill the room. "For decades, we've asked marginalized creators, entrepreneurs, visionaries to forget. Forget the way they were spoken to, excluded, passed over, humiliated. And, in exchange, we gave them a press release, a seat at a panel, a 'we hear you' email." She paused. "I don't want your panel. I want your policies." One of the ministers across the table, a man from Belgium with slicked back hair, leaned forward. "But don't you think this ethics freeze is too aggressive? Many institutions can't catch up overnight." Samira turned to him gently. "Neither could the people they excluded." He blinked. "And yet, we demanded they perform. On time, on brand, on demand." She tilted her head slightly. "So I ask you, why is accountability only too fast when it points upward?" The room went silent again. That evening, social media quietly exploded, even though no recording of the session had been authorized, because someone had posted a photo. It was just Samira, standing alone behind the Oslo placard, speaking. No caption, but it didn't need one. The image spread across LinkedIn, Twitter, private Slack groups, and investor circles with quiet urgency. One repost read, "This isn't a speech, this is a shift." But what happened after the summit was even more critical. The Blake Accord, which had been adopted by a handful of progressive partners, was now being requested by major financial compliance offices across the EU and Africa. Within 72 hours, 14 major airports adopted Tier 1 certification as a boarding requirement for private charter services. 3 major insurance consortiums froze coverage for any institution marked as non-compliant. 5 prominent cultural festivals, some with 30-plus years of legacy, were suspended indefinitely until they passed the new ethics audits, all without Samira saying a word to the press. Meanwhile, Claire Morgan, the woman who once told Samira to wait outside, was seen exiting a federal tribunal hearing in Paris. No statements, no lawyer, just her and a storm of cameras. Because someone inside her former company had leaked emails that showed she had tried to block at least 12 minority applicants from receiving travel grants, based on fit, image, and brand alignment. Samira never commented. She didn't have to. because now the system spoke louder than her. Back in Washington, Ella sat across from Samira in their office conference room. "You know they're scared now, right?" Ella said. "You could literally ask for a seat at the UN Ethics Council and they'd hand it to you." Samira gave a tired smile. "That's not what I want." Ella frowned. "Then what?" Samira looked out the window. "I want them to stop needing me as proof." Ella tilted her head. "Proof of what?" Samira didn't blink. "That their system never worked." Later that week, Samira received an anonymous package. Inside was a single item, a framed plaque that read, "You don't belong here." There was no note, no name. Ella was furious. "You want me to trace it?" Samira shook her head. "Why?" Ella asked. "That's straight-up hate." Samira studied the plaque. "No," she said softly. "That's fear dressed as nostalgia." She walked over to her office wall and hung it next to her ethics certification awards. Ella blinked. "You're hanging it?" "Yes," Samira said, smiling faintly. "Because the next time someone walks in here and says that to themselves, they'll see what happened after." That night, Samira hosted a private dinner, not for press, not for policy, but for 20 young black women entering the fields of policy, ethics, and infrastructure. No dress code, no speeches, just space, safe space. At one point, one of the youngest guests, a 19-year-old from Atlanta named Michaela, raised her hand shyly. "Can I ask, how did you know you were powerful enough to do all this?" Samira didn't hesitate. "I didn't," she smiled. "But I knew I didn't want to wait for permission anymore." It didn't end with an explosion. There was no press conference, no gavel, no apology. The system just shifted, quietly, irrevocably. And in the center of it all was a woman who never once raised her voice. The Blake Accord became more than a document. It became a threshold. Within a month, 84 institutions restructured their compliance standards to meet its ethics benchmarks. 6 private investment networks added ArtCred Tier 1 as a funding prerequisite. And, perhaps most telling of all, 2 of the largest cultural summits in Europe and Asia postponed their entire annual programming pending internal audit. Samira Blake didn't ask for that. She didn't even demand it. She just made it impossible to look away. She was sitting at home when the call came. It wasn't from a politician, not a CEO, not a donor. It was from Howard University. "Dr. Blake," the caller said, "we're naming a lecture hall after you. Ethics and Systems Thinking. You changed the definition." Samira closed her eyes for a second. Not because she needed the recognition, but because she thought of her mother, smiling in that grainy black and white photo outside the library. The one that said, "I got in anyway." Now, her name would live in a place where girls who looked like her didn't need to sneak in. 3 weeks later, Samira stood alone on a tarmac again. Not in Geneva, not in Oslo, but in Senegal. It wasn't a summit. It wasn't an invitation. It was her, returning. She walked through the arrivals terminal without security, without entourage. Just her and a slim briefcase. Ella had tried to talk her out of it. "You've done enough," Ella had said. "You've built the standard. Let the world chase it now." But Samira had shaken her head. "I'm not done," she replied. "Not until I make space for someone else to build the next thing." The village of Thais was smaller than she remembered. Still quiet, still proud. She sat under a baobab tree where her mother once read books out loud to neighborhood kids. A group of young girls ran past her barefoot, laughing, arguing about something in Wolof. Samira didn't speak. She just listened. Ella eventually found her sitting there, staring off. "We've got a meeting with the local trust in an hour," Ella said gently. "Want me to prep the presentation?" Samira shook her head. "We're not here to present. We're here to transfer." Ella paused. "Transfer what?" "Access. Back in D.C., something remarkable happened. The FAA, under growing pressure from bipartisan Senate hearings, passed a resolution to include ArtCred ethical tiering as a recommended standard for all cultural grant recipients tied to federal programs. It wasn't a law, But it didn't need to be, because within days, donors, lenders, and booking systems began aligning themselves with it. Why? Because no one wanted to fund a non-compliant event. Just like that, a single moment of humiliation in a first-class lounge became a federal-level shift in compliance behavior. Samira never celebrated, not because she wasn't proud, but because the cost of change had never left her body. That moment, standing outside the glass doors while Claire Morgan ignored her, still lived inside her like a scar she didn't need to explain. It reminded her how systems worked and how people hid behind them. Now, no one could, because the system had a mirror now, and her name was in the frame. Months passed. The email volume slowed. The chaos settled. People began calling it the Blake effect, a term she hated. Ella had once teased her about it. "You're a movement now." "I'm a person," Samira said. "Movements die. I want mechanisms that last." And that was the legacy. Not the freeze, not the headlines, not the whispers in back rooms, but the mechanism. On the one-year anniversary of the Geneva incident, Samira did something no one expected. She returned, not to the summit, not to the scene, but to the very VIP lounge where it all began. She walked in quietly. No camera, no fanfare. Same marble floors, same front desk, new staff. The woman behind the counter smiled. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I see your credentials?" Samira handed her a slim card. The woman scanned it. Her screen lit up. She blinked. Oh, she said. "You don't need to show this. You're cleared globally." Samira just nodded. And for the first time, she walked past that desk, not with tension, not with defiance, but with peace. Inside, she sat by the window, ordered tea, pulled out her phone, and typed a single note. "I walked back in, not because I needed to, but because no other girl will have to feel the way I once did, ever again." She hit save. Didn't post it, didn't need to, because the work had already spoken louder. That night, Ella asked her, "Do you ever wish it had happened differently?" Samira stared out the window. "No," she said finally. "If they hadn't tried to erase me, I never would have built the pen that now edits their story." She sipped her tea. And now that story belongs to more than just me. In a quiet corner of the world, a 13-year-old black girl stood in front of a screen at the National Museum of Ethics and Policy. A small exhibit was dedicated to the ArtCred protocol. She pointed to a diagram labeled Samira's Threshold. Her teacher leaned down and asked, "Do you know what that means?" The girl smiled. "It means we don't need their room anymore." It started quietly. No press releases, no trending hashtags, just a chain reaction happening beneath the surface. Samira had made her statement. The system had responded. Now the world was adapting. 3 months after Oslo, cultural boards in Dubai, Santiago, Toronto, and Lagos independently released statements committing to preliminary alignment with the ArtCred Tier 1 benchmark. None of them mentioned Samira by name, but they all referenced recent global standards and evolving expectations around ethical compliance in international programming. Ella sat across from Samira in their quiet office in D.C., sipping her usual black tea. "They're not even pretending it's unrelated anymore," Ella smirked. Samira didn't look up. "They don't have to." She turned her laptop so Ella could see. Across the screen, internal memo, Ministry of Culture, France. Rebuild guidelines to preempt U.S. ArtCred pressure by Q4. Ella laughed. "Preempt pressure? Samira, you are the pressure." But that wasn't the part that mattered most. What mattered was what happened next. Samira had turned down speaking engagements, honor awards, even a 7-figure book deal. Instead, she focused on something no one saw coming, the Ethics Architecture Fellowship. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't political. It was a 6-month immersion program for young black women and non-white creatives across the globe, training them in systemic thinking, compliance strategy, and institutional design. Not protest, Samira said to her first cohort. Structure. Protest is the fire. Structure keeps the lights on after the smoke clears. One of the youngest fellows, a sharp 22-year-old woman named Ijeoma from Nigeria, asked her during a strategy session, "How do you know if the change is permanent?" Samira smiled. It's permanent when they start calling it their idea. And that was exactly what was happening. Old boards were rebranding ethics reforms as internal initiatives. Governments were pretending they'd always supported diversity pipelines. Even donors who once ignored her flagged sudden legacy commitments to fairness. Samira didn't fight it. Let them take credit, because they were building on her blueprint. Meanwhile, inside the compliance sector, something strange happened. Insurance groups started tying coverage premiums to ArtCred ethics risk scores. Booking platforms adjusted algorithm visibility based on tier status. In short, if you weren't ethical, you were expensive and invisible. One CEO of a major music touring group reportedly said, "I don't even know who Blake is. All I know is our partner fund threatened to pull $48 million if we didn't hit Tier 1 this quarter." Ella forwarded that quote to Samira. Samira smiled and texted back one line, "Exactly." But behind all the systems and shifts, something more personal was happening. Samira started mentoring, not panels, not Zoom webinars, real, private mentorship. Once a month, she'd spend hours with 3 different women from her cohort. Sometimes they talked strategy. Sometimes they talked grief. Because being a black woman in systems work didn't just mean fighting to be heard. It meant carrying the exhaustion of proving why silence was never neutral. One of her mentees, Adriana, once broke down mid-session. "I'm so tired of being the only one in the room who sees what's broken." Samira reached across the table. "You're not the only one. You're just the first one with the language to name it." And just like that, the ripple grew. One of Samira's fellows joined a legal oversight committee in Cape Town. Another rewrote a grant policy for Australia's National Museum of Inclusion. 2 more launched an ethics tech startup to audit DEI claims for government agencies. None of them had Samira's name on the surface. But underneath, every line of code, every policy clause, every footnote on power redistribution carried her signature. Still, not everything was smooth. At a private donor summit in Zurich, a leaked document revealed that a consortium of legacy institutions had discussed a plan to reposition cultural ethics away from disruptive figures and toward universally agreeable frameworks. Ella read the line out loud in disbelief. Universally agreeable frameworks? That's code for erasing your name, Samira. Samira didn't even flinch. "They can try. But what happens," she added with a calm smile, "when the framework they adopt was written by me?" In the spring, Samira returned to Howard University to visit the hall named after her. Inside, a student exhibit had been set up. Designing Accountability, Systems That Don't Forget. Dozens of student projects lined the walls. Apps, compliance dashboards, ethics rating prototypes. She paused at one. A group had built a small AI model that scanned donor language for racial or gender bias in funding approvals. A young girl noticed Samira reading it and lit up. "You inspired it," she said. Samira looked over. The girl beamed. "We called the model SBX, for Samira Blake. X is for exponential." Samira just nodded, her throat tight. That night, alone in her kitchen, Samira opened an old email draft she'd never sent. It was titled, "What I Wanted to Say Outside the Lounge." She scrolled through the lines. Some were angry, some were brilliant, some were just raw. She didn't send it, she deleted it. Because now the world had already heard her, whether it realized it or not. A few weeks later, she received a letter from Geneva, from the same summit that once humiliated her. It was an official invitation, not just to attend, but to co-chair the Ethics Council for their 10-year roadmap. Ella held the letter like it might catch fire. "You gonna say yes?" Samira thought for a long moment. "No," she said. Ella blinked. "No?" Samira smiled. "I'm sending Ijeoma." The jet engine purred in the background. Not loud, not dramatic, just smooth, steady, as if the plane already knew who was boarding. Samira Blake stepped onto the tarmac. No red carpet, no camera crew. Just Ella trailing behind with a leather portfolio and that slightly amused look she wore whenever Samira broke another industry rule. "You sure you don't want to come to Geneva?" Ella asked again. Samira didn't even pause. They had their chance. She glanced back at the terminal building behind them, the same one that refused her entry a year ago. Now, they offered her the keynote, co-chair, private suite. She declined it all, and instead, she was headed to Nairobi, to a gathering with no nameplates, no title badges, just 60 ethics architects she'd personally trained, from 15 countries, ready to redesign the world on their own terms. As the jet lifted into the air, Samira looked out the window. Below her, the city grew smaller, but what she had started grew larger. The Blake Accord wasn't just a document anymore. It was a filter, an industry baseline, and, for some, an invisible boundary they could no longer ignore. Institutions that once mocked her overcorrections now cited her framework in public budgets. Conferences that once excluded her now chased her protégés. And still, Samira never published a book, never sat for a TED Talk, never even opened a Twitter account. She let the system speak instead, and the system now sounded like her. In Kenya, the summit unfolded under a jacaranda canopy, purple blossoms falling like confetti. No gala, no step and repeat, just whiteboards, rough sketches, and long, unfiltered conversations. One young woman from Jakarta stood up mid-session and said, "We're not here to rebrand the world, we're here to restructure it." Everyone clapped. Samira didn't. She smiled, but it was quiet, knowing. Ella leaned over and whispered, "You see what you've done?" "No," Samira replied softly. "I see what they're doing. I just made sure the door stayed open long enough." That night, Samira sat alone by the fire pit outside. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, a note from her mother, old, ink faded, but the message still intact. Build it clean, even if they muddy your name, because one day, someone will walk through it barefoot and call it home. Samira folded the note again. No tears, just a kind of stillness, a kind that only comes when you realize you didn't need to be famous to be unforgettable. Back in DC, the world kept changing. ArtCred Tier 1 quietly became the new minimum for cultural credibility. The FAA, UNESCO, and even 3 private banks merged their reporting standards into something called the Samira Protocol. Samira never approved the name, but she didn't reject it either. Because this time, it wasn't about her. It was about who came next. Ijoma, now just 23, was invited to lead the Ethics Council for the Global Heritage Consortium. Adriana was building an app to audit real-time event inclusivity. And Maya Jones, the same girl Samira had mentored back in year 1, just landed a spot on the compliance board for the Paris Biennale. Ella forwarded her the news with a note. "You're becoming a constellation." Samira laughed for the first time that week. Not loud, just deep. The kind of laugh that starts in your bone. A few days later, Samira received a personal invite. This time, not from Geneva, not from Davos, but from Howard University. The student body had voted to rename the Ethics and Power Institute. They wanted to call it the Blake Center for Systems Integrity. Samira didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She simply wrote back, "Only if you include names of those who never got invited into the room." In the final weeks of the year, Samira began dismantling her public-facing roles. She quietly stepped down from her advisory board positions. She transferred her shares in the ethics compliance firm she co-founded. She even redirected speaking fees into scholarships for rural girls in Senegal and Guyana. Ella panicked. "Are you retiring?" "No," Samira said. "I'm doing what they never expected. I'm moving aside with dignity." Ella stared. Samira continued. Power isn't proven by how long you hold the mic. It's proven when you teach someone else how to use theirs better. On her last public appearance, Samira walked into the U.S. Cultural Funding Forum. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't on the list. She was just there, observing. At one point, a young black woman on stage quoted from Clause 3 of the Blake Accord. She didn't know Samira was in the room. She didn't need to. The work had transcended the name, and that was the point. That evening, Samira rode home in silence. No press clippings, no accolades, just a soft playlist humming in the car and the DC skyline outside. Ella finally broke the quiet. "What now?" Samira looked out the window, then said, almost to herself, "Now, I watch. The system no longer belongs to them, and it no longer needs me to hold it up." She smiled, eyes calm. "That's how I know it's real." What would you have done if someone told you to wait outside in a building you helped build? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're watching from, because voices like Samira's, they start in silence, but echo across borders. If this story moved you, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Dignity doesn't shout. It rewrites the rules.